Hello, and thank you for choosing the Boulder Spirits Adventure Kit. My name is Ryan Negley, and seated next to me is the proud owner and operator of Boulder Spirits, Mr. Alastair Brogan.
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Alistair, and thank you for choosing the Boulder Spirits Adventure Pack and joining us here in Boulder, Colorado for a guided tasting through our whiskies.
If you're watching this, you've already scanned the QR code on your tasting sheet. The numbers on the box directly correlate with the order of whiskeys in which we taste. In position 1, we're going to start with our Boulder Spirits Straight Bourbon Whiskey. In position 2 is going to be our Bottled & Bond Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Position 3, we move over to our Sherry Cask Finish Bourbon. Position 4 is going to be our American Single Malt Whiskey. In position 5, we've got our Bottled & Bond American Single Malt Whiskey. And we finish the tasting with number 6, our Peated American Single Malt Whiskey. Get your glass, get cozy, and let's have a fun conversation about Boulder Spirits whiskeys. Alistair, let's kick off this tasting with position 1, our flagship bourbon, the Boulder Straight Bourbon Whiskey, with a mash bill of 51% corn, 44% malted barley, and 5% rye. Tell me a little bit about the background of that recipe.
Well, in the UK, we don't drink a great deal of bourbon. And I find bourbons that are 60-70-80% quite sweet, and they've got a lot of heat to it. So what I wanted to do is something very different. And we wanted to add 44% malted barley to the 51 corn, and then add a little rye, 5%. The reason for that is I really wanted to calm that heat and sweet down. I wanted to make it smoother, I wanted to make it a little bit more approachable. And because we're using a traditional Scottish copper pot still, I really believed that we would get the most out of that barley mash on top of the corn.
Now, you talk about the heat and the sweet that the corn provides, and a very important part of our recipe isn't so much about how much malted barley we have, but how low that corn is. Now, the corn is certainly providing a blank canvas for American oak to work on with its sweetness and with its oils, but really with this high amount of malted barley, really positioning our bourbon to have a lovely soft mouthfeel, soft nose, and really a very long, soft finish. So, getting into this whiskey a little bit, let's find a few flavors that we are very familiar to talk about it with our guests here. Off the nose, I'm immediately to that bushel of apple kind of flavor, and really that is absolutely from the malted barley and that low corn. A tiny bit of spice might tickle on the nose a little bit, but you know it's not going to be one of these high rye bourbons. I think one of the most predominant notes of our bourbon whiskey is certainly how easy it is to the first sip of the palate. Tell us about why you wanted to design a bourbon that was more geared towards the malt realm than the corn.
I think for me, I wanted to do something a little different. A lot of distilleries in the US are doing things very differently, and that was part of it. Because we do a single malt whiskey as well, I like those flavors that malted barley gives. And we didn't know how much rye to put in at the beginning, so we just kept that pretty low. And I wanted something which was soft and approachable for a bourbon. And that's really what I wanted to achieve.
And hardly any bourbons in the United States are distilled on a pot still.
Yeah.
How important is that to the flavor of our whiskey?
Absolutely vital. I mean, malted barley pot stills were designed for malted barley. And as such, really the malted barley will shine through with our Scottish copper pot still that is designed for malted barley. So I think that the flavors of the malted barley are really coming, not necessarily to the fore, but they add a different dimension to what people normally would think of a bourbon.
Of course, we're in Boulder, Colorado. Beautiful city, over a mile high. We see more than 300 days of sunshine a year. We see massive temperature swings, but also an incredibly low amount of humidity. We're essentially a high desert climate. Tell us about the climate's aspect and how it plays into the flavor of our whiskeys.
Well, being over a mile high, having a semi-arid environment, what we find is we get huge swings in temperature, which means huge swings in pressure, and huge swings in pressure really starts drawing the new make spirit, once we put it into the barrel, into the carbon filter and then pushing it out at a lot faster than you would have at, say, sea level in a different climate. We reckon we're losing about 3 times more to evaporation through these barrels at this climate than you would if you were at sea level with a climate that really is more consistent. So really it makes a huge difference, and you can actually smell it in the air as that angel share is pumping out of these barrels.
I've really noticed that with our big summers that we have here, and to expound on that just a little bit, we don't have very much barometric pressure here. There's a very low humidity, so not a lot of moisture to really keep some of that spirit in the barrel. So we're really getting our spirit to really get past that first layer of char oak and really accessing some of those middle oaks where we get a little bit of that drier, more of a cedar kind of quality, which for me really provides just a really long, wonderful, easy finish.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we couldn't have any whiskey without talking about the importance of water. And the water that we use, both in proofing before entry into the barrel, as well as before we put it in the bottle, comes from where?
We use Eldorado water. It's a spectacular well water source, about 6 miles south of here. And they've been producing spectacular water, winning lots of competitions throughout the world. And water is one of the most vital aspects of whiskey. Kentucky has got phenomenal water. Scotland's got phenomenal water. There are some places you wouldn't want to make beer or whiskey. But we are very blessed that we have got some spectacular water locally here in Colorado.
So you combine this kind of a fun, funky mash bill built towards that drier palate, distilled on what we're really proud to say, which is the largest pot still in the state of Colorado. Aged in, of course, wonderful Boulder, Colorado. Proofed with our local Eldorado Springs water. We're really able to taste the elements that Colorado provides and to put a really flavor stamp on our bourbon whiskey that's uniquely Colorado.
I think whiskey is about process and location. And we've got a location that's very different from other locations, we've got a process that's different from other processes. And I think that's one of the reasons this whiskey is so unique.
Well, we've made it through the bourbon. I think it's about time that we move on to the next expression, which is gonna be our bottled and bond bourbon. Bottled and bond, of course, meaning that it is aged no less than 4 years. It is aged in a bonded warehouse. It is gonna be bottled at exactly 100 proof. And you cannot marry the whiskeys between seasons, so you can't marry a 4 and a 5-year-old barrel, so it's gotta be the same distilling season. Now, Alistair, our bottled and bond bourbon, I believe is a terrific expression of what one singular year of aging difference makes, and how much development here in Colorado 1 year of aging can really put on a spirit. Now, of course, our bourbon is just under 3 years old, or right at 3 years old for our typical bottling. The bottle and bond has to be at least 4 years old. But please tell me what you feel about the spirit development that happened in this extra year of aging.
You know, it's just that step up from our Boulder bourbon going to the bottled and bond, that extra year and a bit, 2 summers, it makes all the difference.
And complexity, I think, is that key word here. We still get our mash bill and our flavors that come off of this whiskey, but the spirit itself, the esterification, the maturity of the spirit that happens inside the barrel, with that extra summer, could be even 2 extra summers that happen with our Bottled and Bond series, really creates almost a layer of texture that's not on our flagship bourbon. Gives us a bit of on the palate crystallization, something to the palate to really grab onto. And of course, the development of flavors for myself, we get a lot more of that grain flavor, and the fruit notes are just amplified, all that extra amount. What did you think that was going to happen, knowing that we had 3-year-old whiskey? Could you even foretell the future of what that 4 or 5 year mark would mean for us?
Absolutely not. We had no idea what it was going to taste like, because we're using a unique mash bill in the US, and we didn't know how we've got great experiences with other spirits, and we didn't know how that mash bill would play for another 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And now we've got whiskies that are just over the 5-year mark, and there's still a development within that. Where it will be in 6 or 7 years, I don't know. And we're one of the few people in the US that are doing bottled and bond, because most bourbons are straight, 2 years, and really bottled and bond is something which a lot of distilleries aspire to get to. And I love, even although I'm from the UK. I love the history of the Bottled and Bond Act and all the how it happened and why it happened.
Now, as we taste this whiskey, and I have my own personal tasting notes that I like to give out, but I'd like to give you the chance to really imbibe this whiskey, set it on your palate, find some flavors that suit you, and then hit pause, because I'm going to tell you that for me, this is oatmeal raisin cookies all over the place. I just love this wonderful grain texture too that it's got to it. There's certainly this buttery element, and that's got to be our pot distillation coming through, adding that roundness to our bourbon that it has. And then of course that rye that comes in and just sprinkles just that 5%, just that little bit of spice, that little bit of cinnamon, and of course virgin oak barrels in this very arid climate. It's kind of pushing that boundary, and it tastes more than 4 years old.
Absolutely, and remember, it's another 8% alcohol by volume. So there's a little bit of a step up from the 42 alcohol by volume, the Boulder Bourbon, and I think it works really, really well with that. The depth of complexity, there's just an added layer. The cinnamon for me, it's not as oaky and as sweet as I thought it could be. It almost seems to have leveled off of that on that. With that 2 years. And I think part of that is, again, the mash bill of the heavily malted barley.
Exactly, it's still a drier bourbon. The older it's getting, it's not necessarily getting sweeter, but just really becoming a bigger, better spirit.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move into our Boulder Bourbon Sherry Cask Finish whiskey. Now, Alistair, we borrowed a little bit from the old world and chose to finish our bourbon in a Oloroso sherry cask. Of course, Oloroso wine being from Spain, a bit more of a dark fruit forward fortified wine, but really something that's utilized more in the malt whiskey in the European whiskey world. What was our approach to utilizing an Oloroso sherry cask to finish our bourbon?
Well, the line of thinking here, Ryan, was really because we had a very heavy malted barley mash bill in our bourbon, 44%, we felt that malted barley is very used to clinging on to whether it be sherry or it be port or it be Madeira. And I haven't really tasted a great number of bourbons that have been well finished. I always feel that there's two distinct flavors in it. There's the sherry and then there's the bourbon. I think it works with our bourbon because of the heavy malted barley mash bill, 44%. And I feel that the sherry really clings to that malted barley, so it infuses into that malted barley, and you get these notes that you would sometimes get from a Scotch whiskey that's been finished, but it's still distinctly a bourbon. You're still getting that sweetness of the corn, you're still getting that spiciness.
Now, as we get into this whiskey, it's really, really important to touch on how it is a complete spirit. Certainly it is a finished whiskey, so we've seen two oaks, 100% virgin char American oak, as well as European oak that of course held the Oloroso sherry wine. We spoke on how there can sometimes be two different flavor profiles that come through, and we were really lucky that we were able to achieve a unified spirit and really make the flavors of this dark fruit and this wonderfully dried Mediterranean style fruit really cling to our whiskey and become a whole spirit. Do you have any favorite tasting notes, and where does your palate go with this whiskey?
I think definitely on the nose I get apricot. On the palate there's that sort of velvety viscosity. There's a lot more viscosity on the tongue, and at the end, pretzels and peanut butter comes to mind straight away. And I hate to say that because I'd never had pretzels and peanut butter before I came to the US. But pretzels and peanut butter, and it's just for me a little sweeter. But that sweetness is coming from the finish. It's not coming from the corn. It's not coming from the barrel, the sugars from the barrel, and I can distinctly feel those sugars coming from the sherry.
I think taking that old world style of applying fortified wines on the finish of the whiskey that just hasn't been done all that much in American whiskey. but with the rise of our craft brothers and sisters out there creating new flavors, we've really started to see the uprise of finished whiskeys. But again, the high malt on this really does create just this, as you mentioned, a lovely velvet mouth feel. It's a bit of a darker fruit flavor, more of a, for myself, a plum. Really makes me kind of want the sun to drop down a little bit and become a bit of an evening whiskey, if I may. I'm really proud of this whiskey, very much so because of it's a complete spirit and not a finished bourbon whiskey that's two different things.
Absolutely.
Well, Alistair, good job. Kudos to you on a great finished bourbon whiskey, and I can't wait to get into the American single malt whiskey next. All right, let's move along to position 4 and our American single malt whiskey. Our American single malt whiskey is made of 100% malted barley. It is cooked on, again, the largest pot still in the state of Colorado. And most importantly, our single malt is dedicated to 100% virgin American oak aging. Now, Alistair, when you were beginning to design the style of your whiskey, how imperative were each of those elements on the grain, the still, and the location to making your single malt whiskey?
Absolutely imperative, Ryan. I brought a still over from Forsyths in Rothes. They make most of the stills for the Scotch whisky industry. It was designed specifically for a heavier spirit because we're putting it into new oak barrels. And I didn't want that spirit to be overtaken. I wanted to keep that depth and complexity and not allow the barrel to overtake. So it was essential that I brought the still from Scotland. Regarding the malted barley, the history of farming and the history of spirits in Europe is all around malted barley. And Scotland has become very good at making stills for malted barley. In the US, the stills are really designed for the heavier grains, the bigger flavors, the rye, the corns, the wheats. So the still was really imperative, and the malted barley was important, as well as the yeast. I wanted to do a distiller's yeast. I didn't want to use brewer's yeast. And a lot of distilleries in the US that are making single malt whiskey, they're really making it off a beer mash to make single malt whiskey. We're using a distiller's mash to make our single malt whiskey. But here's the thing, there is enough of a differentiation, whether it be in the spectacular water that we've already spoken about, whether it be the effect of the new American oak barrels, or whether it be the altitude we're here, up here in Boulder, being a mile high has the impacts as we discussed. But those were enough of a differentiation to make it distinctly American, distinctly Boulder. So there's a huge distinction in our whiskies compared. It's not a copy, it is uniquely American single malt whiskey.
And I think to be able to achieve that balance that we're able to achieve with the imported barley, with that quality still, but to make it work on virgin oak and in this crazy climate that we have of this high arid, low humidity, mountain climate that we age our whiskey in. As we get into the profile of this whiskey and what it tastes like, immediately I love that I get to use the terms clean, bright, and round. Clean really referring to that virgin oak barrel that we're using, that fresh char that gets to clean up those heavy congeners that we get on our distillate. I love to use those terms clean, bright, and round to describe this American single malt whiskey. And that term clean really comes from that freshly charred barrel that's really filtering out the congeners in our otherwise heavy whiskey, and the brightness being from this wonderful imported grain that we're able to use, that incredibly high yield non-GMO grain that just produces these beautiful flavors. The roundness, of course, being from the shape of our still and how we're able to create that bigger spirit, provide a big texture, and really just provide this lovely, lovely representation of true American single malt whiskey. Now, you might want to hit pause here if you're gonna wait for the tasting notes, but for me, I get this lovely orange blossom or orange flower water note, lovely fields of grain kind of feeling, but again, just straightforward through and through American single malt whiskey.
Absolutely.
Kudos, sir. Cheers to you. Let's finish this one up and then we'll move on to our bottled and bond American single malt whiskey. All right, it's time to move along to number 5, our Bottled and Bond American Single Malt Whiskey. Alistair, this one was a big deal for us. When we decided to create a Bottled and Bond American Single Malt Whiskey, which really is one of the very, very first of its kind to be on the shelf as a Bottled and Bond American Single Malt. How important was it that we applied that sense of American history to an otherwise new category of whiskey like American Single Malt?
It was quite risky. I mean, people know what bottled and bond bourbon is, but bottled and bond single malt whiskey, there's hardly anybody doing this. And if they are doing it, it's very small batches. We didn't know how the whiskey was going to develop. And again, like the bourbon, after 3 years, just short of 3 years, our single malt whiskey was ready. We then started tasting the barrels almost every month or every quarter to really ensure that that barrel, as we discussed earlier, wasn't going to overtake that, it wasn't going to overtake the spirit and really sort of dampen it down. So when this came to the bottled and bond period, we were overjoyed at the fact that it just matured better and better and better. It really just adds more complexity, more depth, and really almost a change in those flavors and in the nose. So we were pretty, stoked about this.
Now, when we talk about the terms bottled and bond and American single malt whiskey, we really do get to say that we were one of the first, because first and foremost, American single malt whiskey really is a very, very, very new, not quite category. As of the taping of this in the United States with the TTB, we're fighting desperately hard to make that a category. Of course, there's 120 distilleries around the country making American single malt whiskey, but we were one of the first to be able to put bottled and bond on that label.
Yeah.
Bottled and bond, especially since it has such a deep history of American whiskey, we felt that it was really important to tie history along with this new category that is American single malt whiskey. Now, of course, there is that extra time of age on top of our flagship American single malt. The flavor development over that extra year of aging is pretty phenomenal. What do you attribute that acceleration of development to?
Again, partly because of the climate we're in, partly because we're still getting a lot of flavors and a lot of diversity from that new oak barrel. Also, that this is over about a year and a quarter, similar to the bourbon, bottled and bond, about a year and a quarter, year and a half additional time, 2 summers. Hot summers really accelerates that maturation, that evaporation. So I think that's what I would contribute to. So we're really excited to see moving forward, as our whiskies are now just surpassing almost 5 years, in where this journey is going to take us. Right at the very beginning, I said with malted barley, little concern regarding the barrel overtaking the spirit. At the moment, it's only improving the spirit. At the moment, we're getting better whiskey as those years go on. When that will, for want of a better word, turn, I don't know. Nobody really knows, because we really are at the forefront of American single malt whiskies.
As we talk about this journey that we're taking through the aging and the development of our whiskeys, I think it's about time that we get into the nosing and tasting of it. So get your glass. Hopefully you've already got a little bit of a bottled and bond American single malt ready to go. Before I say anything out loud, hit pause if you don't want to hear the tasting notes. And immediately it's just bigger, it's brighter, it's got a louder voice to this whiskey. For me personally, it's got just this beautiful layer of almost a Nordic personality of fennel that comes through, and I want to eat oysters with this whiskey. Tell me something that you're kind of exploring with this expression of single malt.
I think for me, I agree, but for me, there's a little chocolatey nose on it, and a little bit of almost like an oaty tea.
Sure.
Is like that comes from that malted barley. But again, it's incredible. It just that year and a half just makes such a difference, both on the nose and, as we'll discover, on the palate.
And really on the palate, this development, this extra texture that happens after those 2 summers, this extra amount of oomph, that this whiskey really provides. Maybe that's our climate that we age in. We don't know, and I think that's some of the most fun, magical part of what we get to do is really be some of the first to explore these flavors that very few distilleries around the United States are trying to achieve.
Fun.
Exactly, fun. We hope you're having fun as well. We're about to get into our 6th and final whiskey, which is going to be our peated American single malt whiskey. All right, as we move along to our final tasting, our peated American single malt whiskey. Now, Alistair, this whiskey is tried and true your whiskey. A true representation of imported malted barley that's been peated, cooked on a Scottish pot still, however, aged specifically in virgin American oak, freshly charred barrels. What was the mindset behind putting peated malt whiskey into fresh oak?
Well, I think I really wanted to do it was the first thing, and also not many people had done it. And we wanted to experiment with it. So we wanted to get a low phenol count malted barley. So very, very low. We wanted to almost make it as an expression of peat. And we brought in our malted barley already, peat smoked, and we did exactly the same processes in every way than we do with our other single malt whiskies, as far as the distillation, as far as the mash, which is, again, reasonably unique. But this time I wanted to be lightly peated. So, like most of our whiskies, it was a bit of an experiment to see what happened. We did our cuts differently. We almost diluted down a little bit of our peat. So we came down to about 10 phenols per million, versus a lot of peated single malt whiskies might be up to the 40, 50, or even 100 ppms. So I wanted to be more of an expression. And we did, as I said, we did our cuts a little different. We put it in new oak, and really we hoped for the best. Mm. And as the development of that peat came through, again, we were surprised. It was planned, but we were pretty surprised at how well it came. And it really has struck a chord with a lot of people, even bourbon drinkers, who don't even really know the flavor profile of peat, has really sort of homed in on this.
As we talk about peat and the flavor of peat, many American consumers really know either all peat or no peat at all. And what really I think we're trying to accomplish here is understanding peat and understanding how the slightest expression of peat can be a lovely layer of flavor on your otherwise lightly peated whiskey. And the virgin American oak is only going to add this lovely layer of vanillins and caramelized oak sugars on top. Something that is, of course, note is that we really strive on balance in our whiskeys. And what I think is really extraordinary about this whiskey is the ability to balance freshly charred oak with an otherwise earthy style distillate that peated malt whiskey tends to have. How would you say that the bourbon drinker that you just spoke of is accepting this kind of rich whiskey, even though there is that slight hint of earth?
I think the bourbon drinkers are very familiar with that oakiness and the vanillas, the sugars that are coming from that new oak and that char. So I think as we wanted to make this as an expression, I think a lot of bourbon drinkers and single malt whiskey drinkers can really sort of understand the subtlety of what peat can actually give a whiskey.
And for the single malt drinkers out there, for those that are actually very familiar with malt, this is also a fun new expression because nobody's ever put this much oak on peated malt whiskey. Nope. Nobody's ever put this much intention on applying that level of oak to it in such an immediate sense, meaning that 3-year mark. Of course, our climate is really helping push that spirit into the barrel and really take every bit of that barrel aspect and kind of create its own personality. For you, what does this whiskey represent?
A lot of people who taste this really go back to that Scotch. They say this is like Scotch, and I'm saying yes, but it's distinctly American because of that new oak. And they're able to pick up a lot of those flavors that they're familiar of.
Immediately for me, and again, if you'd like to take a moment to hit pause on that while you find your own tasting notes, for me, this is really a sense of place. This is a walk in the woods. This is walking down the path. This is ferns and the bottom of a forest floor and mushrooms and all of these wonderful earthly things, but with this just beautiful layer of sugar that is just not available in most Scotch single malt whiskeys that utilize peat. I think what we've been able to achieve here, again, is just something that's not only unique, it's unique and it's pleasant and it's good.
It really does take me back to a rainy day in the north of Scotland, wearing my Wellington boots and being out in the bogs. It really, really does. That wraps it up here from Boulder, Colorado. Thank you so much for purchasing the Boulder Spirits Adventure Kit.
Cheers from Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder Spirits, leaders in American single malt whiskey and crafting fine bourbon. Cheers.